There is no doubt the Big Ten was the big winner in the NFL draft.
You are Locked On Big Ten, your daily podcast on the Big Ten Conference. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hi there, you're listening into Locked On Big Ten. Everything you need to know about the conference every day of the week. I'm your host, Nate Dickinson, and thank you for making Locked On Big Ten your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Coming up on today's show, we're going to break down the NFL draft. First, by giving you my reasons why the Big Ten was easily the winner of this draft. Yes, the SEC had a few more players actually drafted, but when you look at the numbers year by year, the massive improvement by the Big Ten this year is a testament to how good the individuals are in this conference, not just the teams. But we'll get to that here in a second. Later on, we'll talk about which players can make the biggest impacts right off the bat for their NFL teams. That's coming up here today on Locked On Big Ten as we wrap up and put a bow on our draft coverage. But first, let's start off with the draft as a whole, because as I mentioned off the top, I don't think there's any doubt in my mind, at least, that the Big Ten was the biggest winner of this draft. Now, technically, the SEC was the winner of this draft. The SEC had 63 players picked. The Big Ten had only 55, but the SEC is always the winner of the draft, or at least has been for the past, I think it's 17 years in a row now. So the point is that in the context of the fact that the SEC always dominates everyone, the fact that the SEC didn't dominate the Big Ten this season is a big, big indicator of the right direction that this conference is heading in. Because we've known that the Big Ten was one of the most powerful conferences in college football always, but it hasn't always been the biggest farm for producing pro talent or draft picks. And if you're a recruit, probably most importantly, it hasn't been the best at getting you the money and to the next level. So being able to assert this kind of information into your recruiting schemes is a big, big get for Big Ten recruits. But let's just get to the numbers first. The Big Ten had 20 picks in the first 2 rounds of the NFL draft, the best of the best. And that led all conferences, not just everyone except the SEC, but everyone. 9 Big Ten picks in the first round tied the SEC. Another 11 picks in the second round put them above the SEC for the time being. And then the later rounds on day 3, the SEC ends up taking over and getting that lead and getting a 63-55 advantage by the end. But the point is, when it comes to the best of the best, the Big Ten was getting picked before anybody else in college football, which is another huge thing for you to be able to go to recruits with. Not only are we getting players drafted, but if you're the best of the best, and the players the Big Ten want are in their high school recruiting classes, then you have the evidence now. Then not only can we keep up with the SEC when it comes to top tier draft picks, but we can beat them. And the Big Ten showed it both on the field and here in this draft over the weekend. A huge get for that number in particular. Averaging 10 picks in the first 2 rounds is huge. It's a Big Ten record, and it's the first time the Big Ten led the NCAA in that category in the first 2 rounds since 2011. So that's the kind of stuff we're talking about here. That's the kind of landmark weekend this was for the Big Ten, and you hope that you can use it to propel them into even greater years to come. That's the winning draft, if you ask me. I mentioned it was 63-55 in favor of the SEC by the end of the weekend, but last year it was 65-48 in favor of the SEC. So a big, big difference going from a 17-point margin to an 8-point margin here in just a year's time. That's a testament to how good the Big Ten was this year and how many stars it was able to produce. Michigan leads all teams with 9 players drafted. That's not surprising. but it is more ammunition for Jim Harbaugh to take onto the recruiting trail and try and beat Ohio State to some more of these recruits, and another shift in paradigm that would suggest that maybe this rivalry could be shifting toward Ann Arbor as well. But that's a conversation for another day. I do want to get into who I think are some of the biggest winners within the individual teams in the Big Ten as well, too. And the first team I want to talk about is Northwestern, because Northwestern had 4 players drafted in this draft, which for some Big Ten teams is an off year. But for the Wildcats, that's the best they've done since 1985. And that's not any normal draft way, way, way back then. In that 1985 draft, 3 out of the 4 players that the Wildcats had drafted were drafted in the 9th round or later. It was a much longer draft at that time. There were less teams. But the point being, Northwestern had a historic draft, despite being pretty bad most of the season. It was not a great year to be a Wildcat on the field, but this is a good thing for at least Pat Fitzgerald to have, to be able to say, hey, yes, we've been off here the last couple of seasons, but at the very least, we're going to be able to produce good players. There's still talent here, and we know at the very least that we are going to be able to make you good enough if he's out there again. Going to recruits. That's the biggest thing I think about when I'm thinking about the NFL draft here, because obviously it doesn't matter to the college teams which pro teams these guys go to or how well they do in the pros, aside from the fact that it looks good for the future players. I don't really think it provides that much more money to schools outside of the fact that the general program success does. The really only advantage you're looking to get here is to be able to have these kind of numbers to tell recruits when you're in their living rooms in the summers and falls and things like that. So why am I talking about recruiting so much when I'm talking about the draft? That's just my natural thought process of it. Another school I was impressed with, Purdue. 5 players taken is the most in that school's history since 2004, just after Drew Brees in 2001. The Boilermakers, of course, had a great season, made the Big Ten championship game, get rewarded with it with players being drafted, and hopefully, again, that can help jumpstart the new regime over there in West Lafayette. Michigan State, another team I wanted to talk about. They've had consistency more than anything else. And there's other teams who have this kind of thing too. Wisconsin, Ohio State, Michigan. I don't think Wisconsin does quite as well as this number, though. Michigan State has now had at least 5 players drafted in every season since 2018. Again, if you're Michigan, if you're Ohio State, if you're, say, a Penn State even, that maybe not that surprising. But given the fact that Michigan has had good years, but also had bad years in that time too, it's definitely reassuring that that consistency is still there in that funnel from Michigan State to the NFL, which, again, is something you tell the recruits. Maryland, 5 players drafted is the most in their school since 2009. A good offensive year for the Terrapins, of course. They're going to be trying to run it back with Talia Tungavaloa here this fall and hopefully run that momentum into maybe even getting some more players drafted next season. We'll see what ends up happening with the Terps. But the biggest success story I want to talk about, and the reason that I put together this list, because I saw this stat on Twitter, is the Minnesota Gophers. Tony Liebert of Gopher Hole, if you don't know the site's just a Minnesota sports blog, he tweeted out this information on Sunday. Since 2020, the Minnesota Gophers have had 14 players drafted in the NFL draft. A good number. Not top in the Big Ten or anything by any means, but a good number to have for any college team. It's even better, though, when you consider that in all of the 2010s, the entire decade, the Gophers had just 12 players drafted. That's PJ Fleck doing what PJ Fleck does. And you can say the good or the bad about him as a head coach, just as you can with everybody else. But with what he's done in the NFL draft, that production is undeniable. And it's part of the reason why everyone in Minneapolis is absolutely loving rowing the boat, because they're making now not only NFL players, but in some cases, like really productive guys, not superstars. Antoine Winfield Jr. we're talking about here, Rashad Bateman out there. Guys who are going to be real productive players, not just late round picks. John Michael Schmitz being a second round pick here in this year's draft. I think this is like, I read the stat, 3 consecutive years the Gophers have had at least one player taken in the first 2 rounds, and they've never had that before. So Minnesota still has a ways to go if they want to get to the top of the recruiting trail. But as far as NFL draft production goes, PJ Fleck's doing just about as good as you can do and setting the tone for what Minnesota is going to have going in the future. We'll see what they end up doing after they lose a whole lot of senior production here this season. But Minnesota Gophers are a team that has just blown out of the water the expectations for what NFL players from Minnesota look like. I mean, again, a decade with 12 picks means that you're getting a guy every year, maybe. And now you're producing, 14 since 2020 means 3 or 4 a year. It's a staggering difference. And the quality of player getting drafted and where they're getting drafted is a big difference too. So the Minnesota Gophers a huge winner, as are Maryland, Michigan State, Purdue, all teams that did really well, Northwestern too. But as a whole, the Big Ten just killed it. As I said, this was a Big Ten win in this draft. The SEC always wins, but there is no doubt that this year the Big Ten overperformed, and hopefully it is the new standard going forward for their teams. We'll continue here in just a moment by talking a little bit more about the individual players now. Which ones could make an immediate impact at the next level? We'll break that down here in just a moment on Locked On Big Ten. Before we do that, though, make a fast break to FanDuel during the NBA playoffs, because right now, new customers can get a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000. That's $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. If you want to bet on Big Ten sports in the fall, futures, who's going to win the Big Ten in the fall, you can go and bet it. If you want to bet on who's going to win the national championship in the fall, hopefully a Big Ten team, you can go and bet it. Of course, there's all sorts of other sports going on too. We can't deny that. MLB's in full swing. NBA playoffs are starting up. NHL playoffs are hitting the second round. That's all stuff that you can find all the lines for at FanDuel.com. And again, you get your no sweat first bet if you head over to FanDuel.com/lockedon and sign up today. FanDuel.com/lockedon for a no sweat first bet of up to $1,000. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. Coming up next time on Locked On Big Ten, we're going to take a look at Tony Petitti's opening press conference. You don't have to listen to it all. I will have listened to it by the time you're listening to this, and I'll be writing things down and getting the show ready here for you so you can get a breakdown of all the things that you really, really need to know from that presser right here on Locked On Big Ten. That's coming up next time here on this program. Let's continue today's show by getting us into the individual players who were drafted in this weekend's draft and telling you a little bit more about what I think are the biggest opportunities for players to get playing time, because there are some guys, even in later rounds, who I see making immediate production at the NFL level, just if for nothing else, the situation they've been put in, more so even than the talent that they have. Not that the talent isn't overwhelming as well. First player I want to talk about is someone we talked about on Friday after the first round in Jackson Smith-Njigba. I just got to touch on it again. I think this is close to as good of a situation as he could have gotten. As a slot receiver, he's somebody who needs the field spread out for him to really, really excel at this next level. I mean, it's NFL passing games. I don't need to be too complicated about it. More receivers you have, the more you stretch out a defense, the more productive you're able to be. But for Smith-Njigba as the slot receiver, having those two guys on the outside is especially helpful for him to be able to hit the ground running right away. And who he has is also really important too, because DK Metcalf isn't just a great wide receiver, but he's a great wide receiver that requires a lot of physical attention too. So maybe some of those guys who would have been bumping up against Jackson Smith-Njigba when he's running his routes, instead they have to go help and cover DK Metcalf or go double team DK Metcalf and help him slow down. On the other side, Tyler Lockett, a guy who is quietly one of the best receivers in the league. This guy's had 4 straight 1,000 receiving yard seasons. I feel like people underrate him a little bit just because he's just been doing it in Seattle for so long and been such a consistent presence in that Seahawk offense that people just kind of take for granted how good he is every single year. And Tyler Lockett's going to be good again for a couple more. He's turning past 30 now, but I believe he's got more in the tank, of course. And if you got those two guys on the outside combined with what Smith-Njigba is going to be able to do from the slot, Pete Carroll's going to have an opportunity to get really creative in what he wants to do with this passing game and Geno Smith. And I'm really excited to see what Jackson Smith-Njigba does and how he fits into that process. But we talked a lot about Jackson Smith-Njigba on our last episode. You can go listen to that. Next name I want to talk about, Chase Brown. Chase Brown ends up getting selected in the mid rounds by the Cincinnati Bengals, and the Bengals just have an opportunity for him to get playing time right away. Cincinnati, there's no secret, runs the ball a lot. Joe Mixon and Samaje Perine were both key pieces. Even when both were healthy last season, they were getting a fair amount of touches. And now Perine's headed somewhere else. So Chase Brown comes in and has an opportunity, I think, to immediately eat up most, if not all, of those carries that Perine leaves behind. Because Joe Mixon's one of the best running backs in the league. He's already getting run just about as thin as he can, even when Perine was there. So Chase Brown's going to come into this system as a running back that has plenty of experience and plenty on the resume that says he can take that beating and take plenty of carries every single game, but also could get involved a little bit more in the passing game in the way that Samaje Perine was for this Cincinnati team. Fit into that role that he leaves behind very well. And I believe Chase Brown's the kind of guy where, no, he's not going to be the starting running back for this team, but he can be what Samaje Perine was for this team, scoring touchdowns, getting yards, getting 15 carries a game from the RB2 spot on that roster. That's the kind of opportunity he has here as he steps into the Bengals uniform. This is big for him in his first season to prove that he has that kind of value, because if not, the Bengals are going to keep running and they're not going to be patient about who they have in there. They'll swap him out and get Joe Mixon, some other backup who can get the job done. No doubt about that. Next name I want to talk about, Joey Porter Jr. for the Steelers. A shocking surprise to me that he ends up falling to the second round, but the Steelers pick him up in that first pick of the second round that they got from the Bears for Chase Claypool. And of course, get the son of former Steelers star Joey Porter as well. So Steelers fans are, of course, happy, but he has a good opportunity here to be a cornerback too behind an outstanding all-pro corner in Patrick Peterson, but also a Patrick Peterson that's on his way out as well too. Only got a few more years left on him. So it's a good opportunity here for him to do the kind of Aaron Rodgers, Brett Favre thing. Take a couple of years, still be on the field in this case, which is great, but learn from Patrick Peterson, play alongside Patrick Peterson, hopefully develop that into an elite secondary. But then when he takes over, be fully prepared to step in and take over as the top corner on that team. And if everything goes right, maybe even one of the top corners in the NFL. We know that the Steelers have plenty of history producing some of those. Other name I want to talk about, Sam Laporta. He's going to be the starting tight end for Detroit. And I was a little bit surprised to see him go where he did. But the fact of the matter is that must just mean that Detroit likes him. And at the same time, TJ Hawkinson got plenty of touches in that offense last season. It's going to be a situation that uses the tight end a lot just because Detroit pretty much always has. And he has an opportunity to step in and be a really productive tight end right away. He is going to be the starting tight end for this team. So it's just a matter of how they use him early in the season and how quickly he can adjust to the pro level, which will impact exactly how big his rookie year is at least. But the Lions, in my eyes, drafting him where he did, are investing on him being this tight end for this team for at least the next few years and seeing if he can blossom into one of the best in the league. Those are the names I wanted to talk about just in my head as the ones who popped out as the biggest opportunities. Obviously, there's a whole bunch of first-round guys who are going to have great opportunities. CJ Stroud's going to start. Everybody else on the offensive line who got picked in the first round is going to end up starting in the second round too. That's not really as much as what I wanted to focus on, as much as the names that popped out to me when I looked down the later parts of the board. So we had some of those. We had Jackson Smith and Jigba there as a first rounder. Joey Porter Jr. might as well be a first rounder, second pick in first pick of the second round. But I didn't want to just go into all of the top picks that are obviously going to be playing a lot as they were top picks. So those are just the names I had. Again, tomorrow on Locked On Big Ten, we're going to get into Tony Petitti's press conference as he gets ready to take over as the Big Ten commissioner. Not officially on the clock yet, but we'll break down that presser for you as well as get into the conference basketball schedules for the upcoming winter. They were released last week. We'll take a look at who has it the hardest and the easiest in the Big Ten next time here on Locked On Big Ten. Wrapping up the show today, a whole bunch of championships were won over the weekend. Starting with softball, Northwestern has won the Big Ten softball championship, while Illinois has won the Big Ten men's golf championship. For Illinois, that's the 8th straight year that they've won that title. Michigan women's tennis has won back-to-back conference titles, and Ohio State wins the men's tennis title. Also, a whole lot of news out of the transfer portal. Peyton Thorne is entering the transfer portal, a huge shock to Michigan State fans over the weekend. The starting quarterback for the past 2 seasons for the Spartans is gone, and he's not alone. Going with him is star wide receiver Keon Coleman and cornerback Charles Brantley. As all of a sudden, things are looking a lot different than they were on Friday over there in East Lansing. In other news, Ohio State's Caleb Brown is in the transfer portal. He was a 4-star recruit in the 2022 class, as was Purdue's wide receiver Milton Wright. He enters the transfer portal as well. So a whole lot of players making moves in the transfer portal. We'll break that down at some point this week. But that's all the news for the day here on Locked On Big Ten. As always, we thank you for making Locked On Big Ten your first listen every single day. Be sure to tune in wherever it is you get your podcasts, on YouTube and on Twitter too. The handle is @LockedOnBig10, and when you're typing it out, it's 10 at the end, not TEN on the keyboard. I'm Nate Dickinson @NateWithSports. We'll be back next time with more on Locked On Big Ten.